Sorry for the offline recorded video, folks. Unfortunately, I touched tips with President Biden at Camp David and ended up getting the same cold that he had when he debated Donald Trump. So I don't want to ruin my voice any more than it already has been by suffering through a full stream. That being said, I still wanted to talk maybe in a more focused and perfunctory manner about the recent Supreme Court ruling concerning homelessness. Now, look, okay, we've talked about this before, folks. All right, the way in which America broadly treats homeless people is symptomatic of it's representative of, I guess, like the epitome of urban rot. It is like the centerpiece. It is the core component of why our cities are falling apart. You know, for most people, homelessness is a problem in the sense that they have to see homeless people and they have to feel bad about homeless people when they're walking around like a downtown area. Maybe they feel threatened, but let's be real. In most places, if you see a homeless person, they're just kind of like a curled up blob underneath a sleeping bag on the street, and it's really just quite sad and pathetic to see them. I don't really think that the average homeless person meaningfully presents a threat to a non-homeless citizen. For most people, the homelessness issue is one of like convenience and comfort. I'm going to proceed with the rest of this, like on the assumption that you don't care about homeless people at all. Because if you did care, like if your moral system was Christ-like and factored in the well-being of homeless people, and that was a part of your decision-making process, then everything that I'm going to say is kind of unnecessary, you know, because the humanitarian argument would win out. Like if you had if you're a good person, none of this should be necessary, I guess. But I want to talk past that because appealing to the, you know, good-mindedness of people who have to deal with homelessness in their city has clearly not worked out very well. Unfortunately, this is one of those things where Republicans and Democrats are both pretty Hitlerite. I mean, it's not entirely even. Like Republicans tend to be worse than Democrats when it comes to a lot of local issues, but unfortunately, as is the case with stuff like NIMBYism, you know, or being able to like integrate mixed development, local Democrats tend to be pretty bad as well. It's like a striated class issue that sometimes transcends you know, normal party lines, which makes sense if you think about it, because liberalism, you know, in the sort of classical sense, encourages progressivism along most lines except, well, class, you know, like liberalism, you know, the way in which our system is structured kind of emphasizes the importance of equal treatment in a meritocratic sense in all lines except class, because class meritocracy, of course, is completely incompatible with capitalism. You know, you can't like simultaneously invoke and defend a system where wealth is constantly accumulated up at the top and you have inheritance and you have such and such, but then also argue in favor of a kind of like completely even, like no matter your class, everyone gets treated the same meritocracy. It doesn't work. It's incompatible. The classical liberals were better about this, incidentally, than modern day neoliberals, but whatever. The recent Supreme Court ruling is bad. It has been historically held legally that you cannot discriminate against homeless people on the basis of them being homeless. And this has always been kind of like a weaselly non-distinction for two reasons. For one, the cops have always been free to harass homeless people for whatever reason they want. Who's going to stop them, right? Like there is never the whatever the law says, the cops have been harassing homeless people for being homeless and arresting them. For two, even if you can't arrest homeless people for being homeless, you can arrest them for doing things that only a homeless person would do. You know, what's that quote? You know, the law and its majestic equality, you know, forbids sleeping under the bridge equally, whether you are poor or wealthy or whatever. You know, like you may not be able to go after a person for being homeless, but you can go after them for like loitering, for example, or public nuisancy. And in this case, right, the question is it lawful for a city to arrest homeless people for sleeping out in the street, even if there are no beds that they can stay at in like a local shelter? Basically, if they literally have nowhere else to go, if there is no possible place for them to stay, can you still arrest them for being, you know, for sleeping out in the street? Now, obviously, sleep's a human need. Everyone needs to sleep. And if they have nowhere else to go, the street is the only place they can sleep, or public spaces, I guess, more broadly in the legal sense. So This effectively, thanks to the Supreme Court ruling, means that it is in fact legal for homelessness to be criminalized at a local level purely on the basis of being homeless. Like there's no extra thing that a homeless person needs to do to meet that legal criteria. It is now official. I saw this little AP News video really quickly that I think hammers home the rhetorical distinction, the way this is being discussed. I already saw the video. It's not new for me. Pre-watched, I know. If you'll hear. Now, I do take issue with this from a rhetorical perspective because, again, I think that unless you're already kind of a monster, you will be sympathetic to any pro-homelessness advocacy purely on the basis that homeless people are human beings who deserve to live decent lives, you know? So when you make pro-homelessness policy arguments from the basis of, well, we're people too, we deserve rights, I feel like you're double dipping a little bit. The people who are receptive to these arguments already agree with you. I think it would be much better for the pro-homelessness advocacy groups, which of course does not mean they're in favor of homelessness, but rather that they support the homeless. Pro-homeless groups, homeless advocacy groups, whatever you want. If for them to take a more matter-of-fact approach to things, because again, like appealing to the humanity of people who are in favor of the Supreme Court ruling clearly has not worked out very well. They clearly don't think of homeless people as human beings, at least not human beings worthy of equal treatment. The big disease in this country when it comes to homelessness is the eulogization of meritocracy. This is a big conservative virtue. The idea is that there is a natural hierarchy that everyone belongs on, and the real problem with society is not the existence of the hierarchy, but rather that different people are in the wrong places, right? People can only get what they deserve, which is why it's wrong to say provide reparations, because those individual black people today who have not been slaves don't deserve it. And to homeless people, well, if you provide homeless people what? Free housing, free bed, free food. You're incentivizing, sort of bum behavior, essentially. Like a person has failed in life and you're rewarding them for that failure. This is the conservative mindset, I say. It's more of a reactionary mindset because it's common not just to conservatives. Everyone thinks in this way, at least to a little bit. I think you could fairly argue that even a lot of left-leaning positions argue, at least from some sense, an idea of an imagined meritocracy. Only the left tends to be a little bit more critical when they're engaging with it. You know, the idea that, say, CEOs are being paid more than they have earned. It's not necessarily a wrong argument. I do think that there's some validity to recognizing the hard work that a person has put in. Am my eyes mistaking me, or is this right here in the Seattle streetlight? Is this sticker the famous communist leader sticker, like Marx Engels? Do you see? You've got like the black and white men with beards and the red background. I think that might be it. It's Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, Mao, right? Those the five, you know? Sometimes a guy edited my face in there once. Personally, I think that was a better one, but you know, put me over Stalin and Mao. Put me next to who do I get along with now? Noam Chomsky? No, not Noam Chomsky. Bernie Sanders? Put me there with Bernie Sanders, you know, heroes of the modern left. Thank you. Anyway, the idea of meritocracy, the idea that everyone should get what they deserve, and a very un-Christ-like belief, by the way, you know, Jesus Christ was not like washing the feet of prostitutes and hanging out with the lepers based entirely on their merits. You know, he wasn't asking the prostitutes how many dicks they sucked that day and handing out, you know, foot massages proportional to the work they put in. Whatever the case may be, you know, my grievances aside, let's continue to get a little bit of the Hitlerite perspective. Yeah, so Hitler, thank you. Fully like a Weimar attitude right here. You could say the same thing if the Civil Rights Act was revoked. We're glad that the federal government has made it lawful to discriminate against people based on like essentially a fundamental characteristic of their being. Not essential, right? Like no one's born homeless in the same way that I, for example, was born with you know, a biological aversion to direct sunlight. But you know, it's pretty damn up there. Homelessness, you know, not exactly like a hat you can take on and or put on and take off. Anyway, you know, Hitlerite behavior, the idea of like, oh, we've returned to the local government the power to deal with the homelessness issue. They're going to put them into camps. That's what they want. Donald Trump has talked about that, by the way, putting like the homeless into camps, like having, was it him or DeSantis? This is not an uncommon idea. Like round up the undesirables, put them into camps. I don't know what it is with that idea. You know, you see it crop up from time to time. It never works out. But that's what we're talking about here, basically. The idea of like ousting, like I live in Seattle, the idea of excising the homelessness or the homeless population from the city. I mean, you're essentially just I mean, it's like leave them to forage for berries in the wild until they get eaten by a bear, or you put them in a camp. To add that existing in a homeless shelter is harder work than any 9 to 5, like by far. You know, you want to talk meritocracy, who's putting the real work in, okay? You know, at least after your shift, you have a bed that's yours to sleep in under a roof that's yours, or at least one that you rent. So if like humane convictions aren't going to do it for some folks, I just want to say this, okay? We're feeding into a cycle that is completely unworkable and irrational. The decision to criminalize homelessness is like wrong and stupid universally, you know, like it doesn't suit anyone. Nobody benefits from this. You know, there's a reason why America has such a terrible homelessness problem. It's a consequence of choices that we've made, policy decisions that we've made, because we don't want to give the homeless anything. Time and time again, we have studies come out that show that yes, if you just give a lump sum payment to poor or homeless people, they will get jobs, they will get housing. They're not all like desperate wastes of people who are like stalling out the clock till they die. You know, a lot of these people just want a chance. It's the same with drug addicts. It's the same with people with mental health deficiencies. Now, I'm not one of those namby-pamby liberals who believes that every single homeless person would spring back up off their feet and immediately get a job and work super duper well if they were given the chance to. There are people who let's say need a little bit more help, but the consequences of the policies that we're wrecking right now are disastrous on an, like, again, we're not even talking humanitarian here, economic level. Do you have any idea how much it costs to throw a homeless person in prison just for being homeless? I mean, seriously, like, you can check the numbers on this. It costs far, far, far less to like build and sustain and pay for halfway housing. You know, you might think that throwing a homeless person into a hole in the ground, I mean, the way American prisons are basically, you might think that's like, oh, well, how expensive could that be? Then you factor in like the court system, the bureaucracy, the prison guards, the fact that like prisons, if they're not privately owned, which is incredibly expensive for itself because the state pays per bed filled, you have contractors who are giving them like maggot infested bread, probably costs like $8 a roll to the local state. You know, it's insanely expensive to arrest them. Nobody benefits from this. It is literally cheaper to just give them like halfway housing, temporary housing that they can use as like a baseline residence. We know for a fact that housing first homelessness initiatives work the best. It's not like a crazy lefty talking point. It's literally tried and true science. I mean, you might as well be arguing against the spin of the electron here. I mean, we're arguing against like the light being split into distinct colors from a prism. It's a law, basically. But no, people want to see the homeless suffer, because if the homeless people aren't suffering, that means they're not getting what they deserve. I mean, what system are we putting in place here, you know? Life circumstance. And by the way, I don't give a shit if it was like a person got cancer all of a sudden, or a person was like a wasted drug addict. I don't care what circumstances led a person to be homeless. My argument isn't, oh, well, the homeless are filled with people who don't deserve that. My argument is the homeless don't deserve that. There's no like middle... There's no like, oh, well, some people deserve it, you know, essentially. I think the baseline human existence should be one of at least moderate comfort, you know, what the state can provide. And the data indicates that that is literally less expensive. You are charging money. You are paying more in taxes to make homeless people suffer. Like, that's a bonus for you. You're paying out for that, you know? And it ruins our cities too. At every level, our cities are being ruined because people don't want to address the homelessness crisis in a serious or sensible way. You know, we get our like benches at bus stops and subway stations taken away because we're worried homeless people will sleep on them, or they have those awful like you know, anti-humane benching little like the things in the middle that keep you from laying down on them. You know, we don't have like proper shade or seating in a lot of public areas because, again, people are worried it's going to turn them into like a homelessness hotspot. People don't do stuff outside anymore. Downtown areas are wasting away. Why? It's not because we're not being hard enough on the homeless. Trust me, their life is hard enough as it is. And again, I live in Seattle. There are plenty of homeless people here, and the police have, trust me, no trouble whatsoever giving the homeless people a hard time. Plenty of them get arrested, plenty of them get kicked away, but for what? Does it solve the problem? No, of course not. The problem is fundamental. It underlies basic socioeconomic principles, a liberal perspective on this. And by liberal, I mean economically liberal. Like, let's just look at the bottom line. Let's just look at the ledger. Makes it pretty goddamn clear that what we're looking for here is a systemic solution that costs less money, subjects homeless people to less harm, and changes the systems that are forcing people into homelessness to begin with. And there's a million places that you can go with that. You know, you can talk about employment law, you can talk about housing development, you can talk about a million different things. But You know, I don't know. I mean, I really do blame like a lot of people on this, but the cons especially, because the conservatives are usually the ones who are most open about just like literally hating the homeless. Like conservatives will just talk about them like they're dogs or animals or whatever, which for one, very Christ-like of you. That's very good. That's very good. And for two, it's not very return with a V to tradition, you know? The homeless didn't used to be thought of the way they are today. The funny thing is, like, and I've said this before, the modern day conservatism, like reactionary conservatism in the United States, is a stone throw away from like open neo-Nazi fascist rhetoric. And I don't think that's hyperbolic at all. Like, you can look at like any of the policies or practices put in there. You've got liberalism and then you've got fascism. There's not really like an interim ideology. People call it paternalistic conservatism sometimes, but what they really mean is authoritarianism. There aren't that many ideologies. The idea that there are is like a 4chan internet brain thing, you know, 200 IQ bouncing up and down the political compass. Political compass test, by the way, also an internet thing, okay? You've got liberalism, socialism, and fascism. There are like outlying fringes, you know, some people still claim to be monarchists, but they're not really. There aren't any monarchists these days. There are fascists, there are liberals, and there are socialists. That's the real game. And the way that the conservatives treat homeless people, you know, fascism is a modernist ideology. It is fully a post-industrial revolution modernist ideology. It used to be that homeless people, depending on the society, the time and place, I mean, the treatment that they experienced varied massively. You had village idiots back in the medieval days who were treated halfway well because it was Christ-like to treat your neighbors well, you know, much in the same way that the law of hospitality used to be very well and widely regarded, because in a world where you might have to travel 3 days on cart to like get between towns, it's actually really important that everyone be expected to like open their doors up to a weary traveler. And if you didn't follow that rule, that, you know, I mean, they said God would punish you for it. I think personally they would just, you know, like give you really mean looks at the marketplace if you were known for not following that rule. In some cases, they'd get you in trouble. Your ass would get your hand chopped off. The treatment of homeless people is a very modern phenomena. The idea that like we live in the a modern day rat race where everyone is like rushing ahead constantly and trying to you have to maintain like a certain level of economic output, and if you can't do that, you fall behind, and if you fall behind, you deserve misery, poverty, squalor, and death. And that's just like, I don't know, man, that's not very trad. Like, I feel like a lot of fascists in particular sneer at that rat race as a kind of, well, depending on how far right they are, they say it's like kind of let's say Semitic value, you know, depending on how open they want to be with the Hitlerite stuff, or they'll argue that it's like liberal shit, you know, which I mean it kind of is. The idea that like every person's value is derivative entirely from their their economic output. They'll argue for stuff like the family, the nation, the race. But then how do they treat homeless people? Pretty bad, right? It's weird. It's kind of ideologically inconsistent. You would think that there would be kind of like a communal brotherhood, but no, the far right sort of like obsession with weeding out degeneracy gets in the way of their own value. All of a sudden it becomes clear they're not actually in it for family, kin, brotherhood, nation, whatever else. In reality, they're just as sneeringly contemptuous towards the poor as any liberal. They just have an added level of like imposed moral condemnation on top of it. It's not just the meritocracy thing. Now it's also the degeneracy thing. And I guess what I'm getting at here is that I hate America. I hate the Supreme Court. I hate homelessness as a crisis, you know, and this is such a solvable problem. Like, we literally have a uniquely bad problem with homelessness here, and it costs us more money than it would to fix it. And we choose to spend that money to make people suffer because we think that in a morally just society, they should be suffering because they failed. I don't know. It's not good, folks. It's not good. I don't know how much in practice this Supreme Court decision is going to change things, because the homeless have been hounded by the police as on the grounds of them being homeless for a long time. It's not new. Just realized that I had my alerts volume on this whole time. I hope during the recording no audio came through. I guess it'd be kind of funny if someone did like an offline donation and the TTS popped it up and that just played over while I was talking. And if that happened, I wouldn't know. I guess you'll find out. All right. Good luck out there.